He gave this company 3 years of his life. Today, they threw him away in 90 seconds. Nobody said a word, but everybody knew the truth. What she didn't know was exactly who she just fired.
Do it now!
Hurris, one phone call, one sentence, and everything was about to change. He wasn't just an employee. He owned 22% of the company that fired him.
I know everything.
If you have ever been humiliated in front of people who used to respect you, if you have ever driven home in silence, wondering how you were going to explain to your child that everything was about to change, then this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what this single father did after being fired will make you want to hit subscribe, and never underestimate a quiet man again. This is the story of Ethan Cole, and the one phone call that turned an entire company upside down. Ethan Cole was 34 years old, and for the last 3 years, he had been the most reliable, most overlooked employee at Hallworth Logistics. He arrived first every single morning. He left last every single night, unless it was his week with his daughter, in which case he left exactly on time, not a minute later, because 7-year-old Lily Cole was waiting at the school gate with her fox-shaped backpack and a drawing she had made for him that day. Ethan had light olive skin, short dark brown hair combed neatly to the side, a lean athletic build from years of restless energy he no longer had time to spend at a gym, and warm brown eyes that had learned over the past 2 years how to hide exhaustion behind a calm, steady expression. He wore the same uniform every day, a navy blue button-up shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbow, dark gray trousers, and on his left wrist a worn silver watch that had belonged to his late wife, Sarah. Sarah had been gone for 2 years. Cancer had taken her quickly, almost cruelly quickly, and Ethan had spent the 18 months afterward learning how to braid hair, how to pack a lunch that a picky 7-year-old would actually eat, and how to smile at bedtime, even when his chest felt like it was caving in. The illness had come without warning, a persistent cough that Sarah had joked about for weeks, before a scan revealed something far more serious than a stubborn cold. 18 months of treatment followed, a blur of hospital waiting rooms with bad coffee and worse magazines, of Ethan holding Lily's small hand in one arm and Sarah's IV-tethered hand in the other, of trying to explain to a 5-year-old why Mommy's hair was falling out, and why some nights Daddy cried quietly in the bathroom with the water running so she wouldn't hear. Sarah had fought harder than anyone Ethan had ever known, and in her final weeks, weak but lucid, she had made him promise 2 things: that he would let Lily see him grieve honestly, rather than pretending everything was fine, and that he would not let sorrow make him hard or bitter toward the world. Ethan had kept both promises, some days better than others. Work had become his anchor. Hallworth Logistics was not glamorous. It was a mid-sized freight and supply chain company on the edge of the city, all concrete floors and humming forklifts and fluorescent lighting, and Ethan worked as a floor operations coordinator, quietly fixing problems before they became disasters, quietly training new hires, quietly being the reason half the warehouse ran on schedule. Nobody applauded him for it. Nobody was supposed to. Every weekday began the same way. Ethan's alarm went off at 5:15, not because Hallworth required it, but because mornings were the only unhurried time he had with his daughter. He would slip out of bed quietly, pad down the hallway in socked feet, and start the coffee maker while the apartment was still dark and cold. By 5:40, he was standing at the stove making scrambled eggs exactly the way Lily liked them, soft and slightly runny, never rubbery, because she had strong opinions about eggs the way only a 7-year-old could. He packed her lunch the night before so there would be no morning scramble over missing juice, boxes, laid out her clothes on the chair by her bed, and by 6:15 he was gently shaking her awake, humming the little tune Sarah used to hum, the one about a sleepy fox who didn't want to leave his den. It was a small, unremarkable routine, the kind that never made anyone's resume impressive, but it was the architecture that held Ethan's entire life together, one ordinary morning at a time. At Hallworth, Ethan had built a quiet reputation among the people who actually noticed things. The overnight shift supervisor, a heavy-set, soft-spoken man named Reuben, often said that Ethan had a mechanic's mind for people, meaning he could look at a chaotic, loading dock and instantly see which small adjustment would fix the largest problem. He trained new hires patiently, never condescendingly, and he had a habit of remembering birthdays, minor personal details, small kindnesses that cost him nothing but meant everything to warehouse workers who were used to being treated as replaceable. Marcus, the young forklift operator whose mother needed dialysis 3 times a week, often said that Ethan was the only person in management who had ever asked him, sincerely, how his mother was doing, and actually waited to hear the answer. Priya, the shipping clerk with a soft Mumbai accent, trusted Ethan enough to tell him, quietly, over a break room coffee, that a previous director had once suggested she work on sounding more standard before client calls, and that she had never repeated that comment to anyone else out of fear it would cost her the job entirely. The trouble started, as it so often does, with someone else's failure. Victoria Hale was the senior operations director, a woman in her late 40s with a sharp, severe bob haircut and tailored charcoal blazers that seemed engineered to intimidate rather than to fit. Victoria had been brought in 8 months earlier from outside the company, and from her first week she had made it clear that she saw the warehouse staff as replaceable parts in a machine she alone understood. She missed a major shipment deadline for a client called Bregman Retail, a mistake that cost the company nearly $200,000 in penalties. And rather than admit the scheduling error had come from her own office, she needed someone else to carry the blame. Ethan, steady, quiet, without political allies in upper management, was the easiest target in the building. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, Ethan was called into a glass-walled conference room he had entered maybe 5 times in 3 years. Victoria sat at the head of the table, flanked by a nervous-looking HR representative named Doug, who kept his eyes on the folder in front of him rather than on Ethan's face. "We've reviewed the Bregman shipment failure," Victoria said without preamble, "and the scheduling error traces back to your station." Ethan blinked. "That shipment wasn't on my schedule at all, Victoria. I flagged the conflict in writing 3 weeks ago. I have the email." "The email doesn't matter," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "What matters is that someone has to be accountable, and the timeline shows negligence on the floor level. Effective today, your employment with Hallworth Logistics is terminated." "Victoria," Ethan said, keeping his voice level, "the shipping schedule for Bregman was locked 2 weeks before the delivery window. I flagged the conflict with the Denver route on March the 3rd, in writing, copied to your office directly. If you pull the timestamp on that email, you'll see it predates the so-called negligence window by 17 days. Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a flicker Ethan recognized immediately as the look of someone who already knew she was wrong and had decided not to care. "The timeline in this report," she said, tapping the folder without opening it, "was compiled by an outside auditor, not by me. I don't control what the numbers show, Ethan. I simply have to act on them." Doug, the HR representative, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Clearly aware that the audit trail Victoria referenced had, in fact, been assembled at her own request, from data she herself had selectively provided. Ethan looked at Doug directly, watched him avoid eye contact, and understood in that instant that no one in the room was going to say the obvious truth out loud. Doug slid a severance document across the table without meeting Ethan's eyes, and just like that, 3 years of showing up first and leaving last were reduced to a single sentence and a manila folder. Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not argue, because arguing with Victoria Hale had never once changed anything, and he had learned that some battles are not worth losing your dignity over. He simply nodded, signed nothing, and asked for a copy of the termination letter for his records. He walked back to his station under the fluorescent lights, past co-workers who suddenly found their clipboards fascinating, packed the small collection of items that had accumulated in his locker over 3 years. A photo of Lily at her 5th birthday, a chipped Hallworth Logistics coffee mug, a spare tie he never wore, into a cardboard box, and walked out through the loading dock doors into a gray, indifferent morning. As he packed his locker, Reuben found him and pressed a folded 20 into his palm for gas, just in case, an offer Ethan gently refused but never forgot. Priya caught his eye across the loading dock and mouthed the words, "This isn't right," too afraid of Victoria's lingering presence to say them aloud. Even the newest hire, a 19-year-old named Casey, who had been on the floor for only 3 weeks, quietly told him that everyone knew the Bregman scheduling conflict wasn't his fault, that people talk, that the whole floor had seen the email he sent weeks earlier, flagging the exact problem Victoria was now blaming him for. Ethan thanked each of them the same way he thanked everyone, sincerely and without self-pity, and carried his box to the car. He sat in his car in the parking lot for 11 minutes before he trusted himself to drive. His hands were steady on the wheel. His mind was anywhere but steady. Rent was due in 9 days. Lily's dance recital costume needed to be paid for by Friday. The modest savings account he and Sarah had built together had been drained, piece by piece, by hospital bills that insurance never quite covered in full. And now, with no warning, no severance beyond 2 weeks' pay, and a termination letter built on a lie, Ethan Cole had nothing standing between his daughter and real, frightening instability. He picked Lily up from school that afternoon exactly on time, because some promises do not bend even when the world is falling apart around you. She climbed into the back seat with a drawing of a purple dinosaur eating a birthday cake, chattering about her day, and Ethan listened and laughed at the right moments, and did not let a single crack show in his voice, because that was his job now, not the job at Hallworth, the real job, the one that mattered. "Daddy, why do you look tired?" Lily asked at a red light, studying him with the unnervingly perceptive eyes that children have. "Just a long day at work, sweetheart," Ethan said. "Everything's going to be fine." He almost believed it himself. That evening, after Lily had gone down for the night, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table and let himself do the math he had been avoiding all afternoon. Rent, $1,400, due in 9 days. Lily's recital costume, $85, due Friday. The modest checking account balance, after 2 weeks of severance and nothing else, would not comfortably cover both, let alone groceries, let alone the modest but real cost of simply existing as a family of 2 in a city that did not care how hard you tried. He thought about calling his sister that night, but decided against it, not wanting to worry her before he had a plan of his own. He thought about the dozen other logistics companies in the region that might have an opening, mentally drafting a resume in his head that would have to explain, somehow, why a 3-year employee with a spotless record had suddenly been let go. He thought too about the quiet, dormant folder of documents in his desk drawer upstairs, the one he had not opened in nearly a year, and felt the old, familiar resistance rise up in him at the thought of using it. That night, after Lily was asleep, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a laptop, a cup of lukewarm coffee, and the termination letter in front of him. He was not, however, quite the man that Victoria Hale believed she had fired. Very few people at Hallworth Logistics knew the truth, and Ethan had worked hard to keep it that way. 4 years earlier, before Sarah's diagnosis, before the world had rearranged itself around hospital corridors and chemotherapy schedules, Ethan had built and sold a small but profitable supply chain software company called Routewise, a scheduling and logistics optimization platform he had coded largely by himself over 3 years of nights and weekends. Hallworth Logistics had been Routewise's very first and most important client, and when a private investment group approached Ethan to acquire the software outright, the deal had been structured so that Ethan retained a significant, silent equity stake in Hallworth Logistics itself as part of the sale, negotiated quietly through a holding entity called Meridian Trust, specifically so that his name would never appear on a public roster of shareholders. He had never intended to become anyone's boss. He had simply wanted security for his family and anonymity for himself, because Ethan Cole had never wanted people to work harder around him out of fear or flattery. He wanted, more than anything after Sarah's diagnosis, to have one place in his life that felt normal. A floor job, a badge, a schedule, co-workers who saw him as nothing more than a reliable colleague. Taking the operations coordinator role at Hallworth 2 years ago, under a slightly simplified version of his name and without disclosing his ownership stake even to HR, had been his way of staying close to something Sarah had believed in, and of watching over an investment that quietly paid for Lily's future, without anyone treating him differently because of it. Sitting at his kitchen table that night, Ethan opened a folder he had not touched in months. The Meridian Trust documents, the quarterly ownership statements, the private line for Hallworth's board chairman, a soft-spoken, fiercely principled man named Gerald Whitfield, who was one of only 3 people alive who knew that the quiet floor coordinator named Ethan Cole held nearly 22% equity in the company that had just fired him for a mistake he did not make. Ethan had never once used that leverage, not when a previous supervisor had taken credit for one of his process improvements, not when budget cuts nearly eliminated the mentorship program he had built for new warehouse hires. He had told himself for 2 years that the ownership stake existed for Lily's future, not for his own vindication, and that using it for anything less than a genuine emergency would betray the very reason he had structured the deal quietly in the first place. But this was different. This was not wounded pride. This was a woman in a position of real power, deliberately fabricating a paper trail to destroy an innocent employee's livelihood in order to protect her own failure, in a company that employed nearly 400 people who depended on that same culture of fairness to keep their own jobs safe. If Victoria Hale could manufacture a false accountability trail against Ethan, an employee with 3 years of clean performance reviews, she could do it to anyone. Ethan thought of Marcus, the young forklift operator supporting his mother through dialysis, who lived in fear of Victoria's mood swings. He thought of Priya, the shipping clerk who had been quietly told her accented English made her less suited for client calls. He thought, finally, of Lily, asleep down the hall, and of the version of fairness he wanted her to grow up believing was possible in the world. Before he picked up the phone, Ethan called the one other person who knew the truth about his ownership stake, his sister, Renata, who lived 2 states away and had been the only family member he's trusted with the details of the Meridian Trust arrangement when he'd first structured it. "You've been sitting on this for 2 years, Ethan," Renata said, after he explained what had happened. "You built that company's software, you own 1/5 of it, and they just fired you for something you didn't do. What exactly are you protecting by staying quiet?" "I didn't want people treating me differently," Ethan admitted. "I didn't want Lily growing up watching her father use money to solve every problem instead of character." "There's a difference," Renata said gently. between using your power to bully people and using it to stop someone else from bullying people. Sarah would have made this call in about 4 minutes flat, and you know it. Ethan sat with that for a long moment, looking at the small drawing of a purple dinosaur taped to the refrigerator, and something in his chest finally settled into certainty. At 11:47 that night, Ethan picked up his phone and called Gerald Whitfield. Gerald answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep and immediately sharpening with concern. "Ethan, is everything all right? Is Lily?" "Lily's fine, Gerald. I'm calling about something else." Ethan explained everything, calmly, methodically, the way he approached every problem on the warehouse floor, the fabricated timeline, the ignored email trail, the termination built on a lie to protect Victoria Hale's own failure with the Bregman account. He did not raise his voice once. When he finished, there was a long silence on the line. "Ethan," Gerald finally said, "you know what you're asking me to consider. I'm not asking you to consider anything on my behalf, Gerald. I don't need my job back. What I need is for you to look at what she's built in that building over 8 months. Because if she did this to me, she has done it, or will do it, to someone with far less protection than I have." Another silence. Then Gerald asked the question Ethan had been waiting for. "Do you want me to bring you back in as who you actually are?" Ethan looked down the dark hallway toward Lily's bedroom door. "Yes," he said quietly. "It's time. Call an emergency board session tomorrow morning. And Gerald, fire every one of them. Everyone who knew what she was doing and stayed quiet. Everyone who let this become normal." The next morning, at 9 o'clock sharp, an emergency notice went out to Hallworth Logistics' senior leadership team. An urgent all-staff address would be held in the main atrium at 10, mandatory attendance for department heads. Victoria Hale arrived in her charcoal blazer, mildly annoyed at the disruption to her schedule, expecting perhaps a routine announcement about quarterly earnings. What she did not expect was to see Gerald Whitfield standing at the podium beside a man in a plain, navy blue button-up shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a worn silver watch on his wrist. The same man she had personally escorted out of a conference room 24 hours earlier. "Many of you know Ethan Cole as a floor operations coordinator," Gerald began, his voice carrying across the silent atrium. "What most of you do not know is that Mr. Cole has held a significant equity position in this company since before many of you were hired, through an arrangement he structured privately at his own choice, because he did not want to be treated differently by the people he worked alongside every day. Yesterday, Mr. Cole was terminated from his floor position based on a fabricated performance record, manufactured to shield a director's own operational failure. I have reviewed the documentation myself this morning alongside legal counsel." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Victoria's face had gone the color of old paper. "Effective immediately," Gerald continued, "Victoria Hale is terminated from Hallworth Logistics, along with 2 members of her direct reporting team who assisted in falsifying the Bregman account timeline. Human Resources will be conducting a full review of every termination and disciplinary action processed under her direction over the past 8 months, and any employee found to have been wrongfully disciplined will be reinstated with full back pay." Victoria opened her mouth to protest, looked once at Ethan, and found in his calm, steady expression not a flicker of triumph, only a quiet, immovable resolve that told her clearly there was nothing left to argue. In the atrium, as the crowd slowly absorbed what they had just witnessed, Reuben was the first to break the stunned silence, letting out a low whistle and muttering, "I knew that man had a mechanic's mind. I just didn't know it came with 22% of the building." A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the room, breaking the tension, and Ethan allowed himself, for the first time in 24 hours, a small, genuine smile. Priya found him afterward near the loading dock, eyes bright, and simply said, "Thank you for not staying quiet," a sentence Ethan would think about for months afterward. Casey, the 19-year-old new hire, asked him half-jokingly if the rumors were true that he'll plan to work the floor 3 days a week, and Ethan told him yes, absolutely, because someone still had to teach him how to properly stack a pallet without crushing the bottom boxes. Security escorted her from the building within the hour. In the weeks that followed, the culture of Hallworth Logistics did not simply return to normal. It transformed. Ethan, now publicly acknowledged as a major shareholder, chose not to install himself as a distant executive in a glass office on the top floor. Instead, he asked Gerald for a new, unusual arrangement. He would serve on the board and consult on strategic operations. But 3 days a week, he would still be on the warehouse floor, in the same navy blue shirt, training new hires and fixing the small problems that made the biggest difference to the people actually moving freight. Marcus, the young forklift operator, was promoted to shift supervisor within a month. Priya was moved onto the client relations team she had been quietly told she wasn't suited for, and within a quarter, she had become the top-performing account manager for the Pacific region. The mentorship program Ethan had built years earlier, once threatened by budget cuts, was expanded company-wide and named, over Ethan's mild protest, the Sarah Cole Fellowship, in honor of the woman whose belief in fair, steady work had shaped the very culture Ethan had spent years quietly protecting. Lily, for her part, understood very little of the corporate details, but she understood that her father came home lighter. She understood that some evenings now, instead of falling asleep on the couch reviewing spreadsheets, he had energy to build blanket forts and read 3 chapters instead of 1. On a warm evening several weeks later, sitting on their small back porch as the sun dipped low and gold over the rooftops, Lily asked him the question she had asked at the red light weeks before. "Daddy, are you not tired anymore?" Ethan pulled her into his side, watched the light catch on the old silver watch on his wrist, and thought of Sarah, of Gerald's phone call, of Marcus's promotion, of Priya's new title, of everything that had changed since the night he had finally decided that quiet dignity did not bathe. Quiet silence forever. "No, sweetheart," he said. "I think, for the first time in a long while, I'm actually not tired at all." 3 months later, on a Saturday morning, Ethan took Lily to the small park near their apartment, the same park where, a lifetime ago, Sarah used to push her on the swings and laugh at how high she demanded to go. Lily was faster on the monkey bars now, more confident, more willing to let go and catch herself on the next rung without looking back to see if he was watching. Ethan sat on the familiar bench, the worn silver watch catching the morning light, and thought about how strange it was that the worst Tuesday of his professional life had somehow become the hinge on which everything else quietly turned for the better. Not just for him, but for Marcus, for Priya, for Casey, for every warehouse worker who no longer flinched when a director's shadow crossed their station. He thought about Gerald, who now called him not out of obligation but out of genuine friendship, checking in some evenings just to ask how Lily's recital had gone. He thought about the Sarah Cole Fellowship, whose first cohort of 12 warehouse employees had just been accepted into a paid weekend training program that would let them move into supervisory roles, something that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. And he thought most of all about the promise he had made to Sarah in her final weeks, to let sorrow soften him rather than harden him, and how, somehow, against every odd, he had managed to keep it. The story of Ethan Cole spread quietly through Hallworth Logistics, and eventually, well beyond it, not because he ever sought attention, but because people who had been quietly wronged for years finally felt safe enough to speak, and people who had quietly done the wronging finally understood that power built on other people's silence rarely lasts. Ethan never gave interviews about what happened. He never posted about it, never turned it into a personal brand, never let the story become bigger than the people it had actually helped. When new hires asked him, months later, why a man with his resources still showed up to the floor in a rolled sleeve shirt 3 days a week, he would simply say that some jobs are not about the paycheck, and that the people who move the freight, who answer the client calls, who show up first and leave last without ever expecting applause, deserve a workplace built on the same fairness he wanted his daughter to grow up believing was possible. And so, on the same warehouse floor where he had once been quietly discarded over a lie, Ethan Cole kept showing up, not as a man seeking revenge, but as a father who had simply decided, on one impossible Tuesday night, that some silences are worth breaking, some phone calls are worth making, and some quiet men are far more powerful than anyone around them ever bothered to notice. Lily never learned the full financial details of what had happened that spring, and Ethan preferred it that way for now, believing that some truths are better shared gradually, in pieces a child can actually hold. What she did learn, in the language a 7-year-old understands best, was that her father had stood up for his friends when someone tried to hurt them unfairly, and that standing up for people quietly, without shouting, without cruelty, without needing anyone to applaud you for it, was simply what being a good person looked like. Years from now, when Lily is old enough to understand words like equity and holding trust and fabricated timeline, Ethan plans to tell her the whole story, start to finish, including the part where he almost didn't make the call at all, where an ordinary Tuesday night very nearly ended in quiet defeat instead of quiet courage. For now, it is enough that she sees him standing a little taller, laughing a little easier, and coming home, more evenings than not, with nothing left over to hide. If this story moved you even a little, remember to like this video, subscribe for more stories like this one, and share it with someone who needs a reminder today that integrity, patience, and quiet strength eventually find their way back around. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.